The order was already moving before anyone saw it. It existed first as a sequence of words arranged in the correct format, stamped, copied, and passed along according to procedure. Its language was precise and unambiguous. Each sentence closed every possible alternative. There was no room for interpretation because interpretation was not required. Only execution was. It traveled downward through offices, desks, and corridors without friction. Each hand that received it recognized the structure immediately. The phrasing was familiar. The cadence was familiar. It matched thousands of orders that had come before it. Nothing in its composition suggested danger. Nothing in its tone suggested urgency. It did not announce itself as exceptional. It did not need to. The order did not ask for agreement. It did not seek understanding. It was not a conversation. It was a directive, complete in itself, sealed by authority and reinforced by repetition. Once read, it moved on. Once acknowledged, it was no longer questioned. The system was designed so that it would not linger. Copies were made. Times were logged. Confirmations were returned upstream, brief and formal. The order advanced step by step, each transfer reducing it further into function. What began as language became schedule. What began as instruction became routine. At no point did it pause long enough to invite reflection. Those who handled it did so with practiced neutrality. Their responses followed training rather than instinct. The correct phrases were used. The correct boxes were marked. No one altered its course, not because alteration was forbidden, but because alteration had never been part of the process. The system rewarded clarity, not hesitation. The order did not describe its consequences. It did not reference terrain, resistance, or uncertainty. It assumed compliance as a constant, as if compliance were a natural law rather than a choice. In its logic, once issued, the outcome was no longer a matter of decision, but of timing. As it descended, the order became increasingly abstract. Fewer words remained visible. What survived were coordinates, sequences, and expectations. The human element receded, replaced by alignment and synchronization. Each level received only what it needed to proceed, nothing more. There were no alarms attached to it. No indicators suggested deviation or risk. It fit cleanly into the existing framework, aligning with established doctrine and accepted patterns. Its authority was not asserted loudly. It was assumed. That assumption carried it forward more effectively than force. By the time it reached those who would act on it directly, the order no longer resembled a decision. It appeared instead as a fact. Something already agreed upon. Something already set in motion elsewhere. To question it would have required interrupting a chain that was already complete. The system moved with quiet efficiency. Preparations began automatically. Timetables adjusted, resources aligned. The order did not accelerate events, it synchronized them. Each component advanced in isolation, trusting that the larger structure accounted for everything beyond its immediate view. No one saw the whole shape of what was coming. No one needed to. The design ensured that understanding was distributed in fragments, never concentrated. Responsibility diffused as the order progressed, thinning until it became invisible. By the time the final acknowledgement was recorded, the order had fully left the realm of possibility. It was no longer something that might happen. It was something that already was. The environment that received the order was built for certainty. Everything within it was arranged vertically. Information moved in one direction. Authority did not circulate, it descended. Each layer existed to refine the order into something actionable, not to evaluate it. The architecture of command ensured that questions were unnecessary, because answers were presumed to exist somewhere above. At the highest visible levels, the order was treated as an object of coordination, rather than intent. It was logged, indexed, and paired with existing directives. Its arrival triggered familiar procedures. Calendars were consulted. Resources were cross-checked. The language of the order aligned perfectly with institutional expectation, which meant it required no discussion. As it moved downward, the order lost context by design. Each tier received only what pertained to its function. Broader rationale was stripped away, not out of secrecy, but out of efficiency. Context slowed execution. Precision accelerated it. The system valued speed that looked like discipline. Those positioned between issuance and execution served as conduits rather than interpreters. Their authority lay not in discretion, but in accuracy. They ensured the order remained intact as it passed through them, unchanged in meaning and unaltered in direction. Their success was measured by fidelity, not judgment. The structure reinforced this behavior relentlessly. Training emphasized clarity, repetition, and adherence. Deviations were treated as errors, regardless of intent. The safest position within the hierarchy was exact compliance. Anything else introduced personal risk without institutional benefit. Meetings occurred, but they were procedural rather than deliberative. Timelines were confirmed. Dependencies were mapped. Potential obstacles were addressed only insofar as they interfered with execution, not with outcome. The assumption remained that the order itself was sound. The system had already accepted it as such. At lower levels, the presence of the order was felt more than seen. Instructions arrived in segmented form, framed as tasks rather than objectives. The emphasis shifted from understanding to readiness. Equipment was prepared, personnel were assigned, movements were scheduled down to precise intervals. No one was asked whether the order should proceed. That question existed outside the structure. What mattered was whether it could proceed, and the structure existed to ensure that it could. The hierarchy insulated itself from contradiction. Any uncertainty encountered along the way was absorbed by procedure. Ambiguity triggered clarification requests that traveled upward, but these requests never challenged intent. They sought only alignment. The order returned unchanged each time, reaffirmed through the same channels that delivered it. Silence was not enforced. It was produced organically. The structure rewarded those who moved efficiently within it. Those who hesitated learned quickly that hesitation created friction. Friction drew attention. Attention invited scrutiny. Scrutiny rarely benefited the individual. As execution approached, the order became embedded in routine. It appeared on schedules alongside maintenance and supply transfers. Its exceptional nature dissolved into normalcy. The system had successfully transformed a decision into an operation. At no point did the hierarchy slow. At no point did it reconsider. The chain of command functioned exactly as designed, precise, disciplined, and impermeable to doubt. By the time the final preparations were complete, the order no longer felt imposed. It felt inevitable. Execution began without announcement. There was no moment that marked the transition from preparation to action. No signal that separated intention from movement. The order had been present long enough that its execution felt less like a beginning than a continuation. When the first steps were taken, they followed paths already cleared by planning and repetition. Units moved according to schedules that had been finalized well in advance. Each movement corresponded to a line in a document, each pause to a margin note. Timing mattered more than circumstance. The order specified when actions were to occur, not why. That distinction was preserved throughout the process. Communication followed established channels, concise and standardized. Messages were transmitted in the expected format, stripped of excess language. Acknowledgements were brief. Status updates contained no analysis. Everything confirmed alignment. Nothing invited reconsideration. Coordination replaced awareness. Individuals focused on their assigned segments, trusting that adjacent elements would perform their roles with equal precision. The system depended on this trust. It allowed complex action without requiring any single participant to grasp the full scope of what was unfolding. There were no discussions about alternatives. The presence of alternatives would have implied choice, and choice had already been resolved upstream. The order represented a settled conclusion. Execution was merely the process of translating that conclusion into reality. Movements synchronized across distances without direct contact. Timetables overlapped by design. One action triggered another not through observation, but through expectation. Each component operated as if the others were already in position, because according to the order, they were. The environment adjusted around the execution without interruption. Normal activity continued alongside it. The order did not disrupt routine. It integrated into it. This integration reduced the visibility of risk. When action resembles habit, it rarely attracts scrutiny. There were moments when conditions differed slightly from expectation. These deviations were noted, recorded, and compensated for within the margins allowed by procedure. None were sufficient to halt progress. The order did not contain provisions for stopping. It assumed forward motion as the default state. Those carrying it out relied on checklists and sequences. Each completed step validated the next. Progress itself became confirmation that everything was proceeding correctly. The system equated movement with success. No one spoke unnecessarily. Silence was not imposed, but it was efficient. Verbal exchange was limited to required confirmations. The absence of conversation reduced the chance of divergence. Words had already been fixed in the order. Repeating them served no function. As execution advanced, individual perception narrowed. Attention focused on immediate tasks. External factors faded into background noise unless they directly interfered with timing or alignment. The structure encouraged this narrowing. It minimized distraction and reinforced obedience. There was no internal debate to interrupt the flow. The design of the process left no space for it. To question would have required stopping, and stopping would have required authorization that did not exist at that level. The hierarchy had already delegated action, not discretion. The order continued to express itself through motion. Each completed phase reinforced the legitimacy of the next. The system interpreted continuity as correctness. There was no mechanism to reassess once execution was underway. By the time the final stages approached, the order had been fully realized in structure and movement. What remained was completion. The system pressed forward, confident in its alignment, secure in its adherence to protocol. Nothing had gone wrong yet. And because nothing had gone wrong, there was no reason to stop. The first indications of failure did not arrive as alarms. They appeared as irregularities small enough to be absorbed by routine. A delayed acknowledgement. A report that arrived complete but slightly out of sequence. A confirmation that matched the format perfectly, while describing conditions that were marginally misaligned with expectation. None of these elements violated the order. They existed within acceptable variance. The system registered them without reaction. Variance was anticipated. Procedures accounted for it. Margins had been built precisely to prevent interruption. The order remained valid. Execution continued. As the process advanced, these irregularities began to cluster. Not enough to form a pattern, but enough to slow certain segments. Adjustments were made locally, within authorized limits. Timelines were compressed where possible, extended where necessary. These corrections did not alter direction. They only preserved momentum. Communication reflected this restraint. Messages remained formal. Language stayed neutral. No escalation occurred because escalation required a threshold that had not yet been crossed. Each update reaffirmed compliance. Each acknowledgement confirmed receipt. The order itself remained untouched. The flaw at the center of the order was structural rather than situational. It did not depend on sudden opposition or unexpected resistance. It existed quietly within the assumptions that shaped the directive. As reality diverged incrementally from those assumptions, the divergence went unnoticed because the system measured alignment, not accuracy. Requests for clarification moved upward through the chain. They were framed carefully, stripped of implication. The questions addressed timing, positioning, coordination. None addressed feasibility. The responses returned quickly, consistent with the original instruction. No modifications were issued. Consistency was preserved. The system interpreted this consistency as reassurance. As execution progressed, localized confusion emerged. Not confusion about what to do, but about why certain elements were not behaving as anticipated. This confusion did not lead to pause. It led to tighter adherence. When conditions become uncertain, procedure becomes refuge. Schedules were reaffirmed. Sequences were rechecked. Personnel were reminded of protocol. The order was cited repeatedly, not to justify action, but to stabilize it. Reference to authority replaced situational awareness. The environment began to resist in subtle ways. Not through confrontation, but through misalignment. Timings that once overlapped cleanly now missed each other by minutes. Movements that were designed to converge instead passed without contact. Each discrepancy was small. Together, they eroded coherence. Still, the order remained unchanged. The structure was not built to recognize emergent failure. It was built to prevent deviation. Warning signs existed, but they were interpreted as operational friction rather than indicators of systemic error. The difference between the two required judgment. Judgment was not part of the process. At lower levels, adjustments became more frequent. Workarounds appeared, informal but compliant. These adaptations aimed to fulfill the letter of the order, even as its spirit drifted further from reality. Success was still defined as obedience. The flow of information grew denser but not clearer. Reports increased in volume while remaining narrow in scope. Each segment described its own difficulties without connecting them to others. The system collected data without synthesis. There were moments when continuation felt less certain. These moments passed quickly. Uncertainty had no procedural expression. It could not be logged, transmitted, or authorized. Only actions could be. The order moved forward, reinforced by the very mechanisms that should have constrained it. Each reaffirmation from above silenced potential deviation below. Each confirmation reduced the likelihood of reassessment. By the time the first undeniable consequences began to surface, the system had already committed fully. The order had shaped movement, allocation, and expectation so completely that reversal would have required dismantling the structure itself. No such mechanism existed. The failure did not arrive suddenly. It emerged gradually, carried forward by obedience, concealed by routine, and protected by authority. The system continued to operate, not because it was succeeding, but because it had not been instructed to stop. The collapse did not announce itself with a single moment. It unfolded as accumulation. What had once been minor misalignments hardened into separation. Elements that were meant to support one another began operating in isolation, still synchronized by schedule, but no longer by reality. The order demanded coordination, but the conditions required adaptation. The system provided only the former. Progress continued because it had to. Timetables were now commitments rather than plans. Resources had been committed, movements initiated, positions assumed. Each completed step narrowed the range of possible responses. Momentum replaced choice. When losses began to register, they were recorded in the same format as everything else. Numbers were entered, times were logged, reports moved upward without emphasis. The language remained controlled. The structure did not distinguish between acceptable cost and emerging catastrophe. Both were absorbed as data. The order still stood. Attempts to compensate intensified. Additional movements were authorized within existing parameters. Redundancies were activated, not to change direction, but to reinforce it. The system interpreted resistance as insufficient force rather than flawed design. What was breaking was not discipline, but coherence. Segments that should have converged failed to do so entirely. Support arrived where it was no longer relevant. Coordination lagged behind events by just enough to be ineffective. Each response addressed the previous moment, never the present one. There were no acts of defiance, no refusal, no visible panic. The collapse was orderly. Procedures were followed even as their outcomes grew increasingly detached from intention. The appearance of control persisted long after control had been lost. Scale became apparent only indirectly. The structure had no vantage point from which the entirety of the failure could be seen. Each level observed only its portion. The full weight of consequence existed nowhere as a complete picture. As losses mounted, the order continued to generate action. Replacement elements were moved forward according to plan. Adjustments were framed as optimization. The original directive was never questioned because it remained the only reference point available. Communication grew heavier, but no less constrained. Reports documented depletion, delay, and absence. None proposed cessation. The language of stopping did not exist within the authorized vocabulary. The environment no longer responded predictably. Conditions shifted faster than procedure could track, yet the system advanced at its prescribed pace, incapable of acceleration or retreat. It could only proceed. The collapse became irreversible not because of a single error, but because correction required authority, that had already been delegated away. Decision-making had been exhausted at the moment the order was issued. Everything afterward was execution. When the structure finally recognized the magnitude of loss, recognition arrived without response. There was nothing left to authorize. No unused mechanisms remained. The order had consumed them all. The failure completed itself quietly. Not with chaos, but with exhaustion. When movement ceased, it was not because the order had been revoked. It was because there was nothing left that could still move. Afterward, the system adjusted. It did not pause. It did not reflect. It recalibrated. Records were finalized. Logs were closed. The language used to describe what had occurred was precise and restrained. Loss was quantified. Absence was accounted for. Timelines were marked complete. The order itself was archived according to protocol, filed among others that had reached their conclusion. No announcement declared the end. Activity simply shifted elsewhere. Attention moved on. The structure absorbed the outcome the way it absorbed everything else, by reducing it to manageable components. There were no investigations that disrupted routine, no visible reckoning that altered the hierarchy. Responsibility did not rise or fall. It dispersed. Each level retained its function. Each role remained intact. The system continued to operate as designed. The order was no longer referenced directly. It appeared only indirectly in documentation and summaries, stripped of immediacy. Its language remained unchanged, preserved exactly as it had been issued. What had followed it was treated as consequence rather than decision. Personnel were reassigned. Resources were redirected. New schedules replaced old ones. The environment returned to a familiar rhythm, one shaped by procedure rather than memory. What had occurred did not interrupt the structure. It confirmed its resilience. Silence settled not because discussion was forbidden, but because discussion was unnecessary. The system did not require explanation to continue functioning. What mattered was continuity. What mattered was that authority remained intact. The order had fulfilled its role. It had moved through the hierarchy, been executed precisely, and reached an outcome. From the perspective of the structure, the process had been complete. There were no lessons formalized in language strong enough to change behavior. Adjustments were incremental, framed as refinement rather than correction. The underlying mechanisms remained untouched. Elsewhere, another order was already moving. It followed the same channels. It carried the same certainty. It was formatted with the same clarity. The system received it without hesitation, just as it had received the last one. Nothing in the structure indicated awareness of repetition. Nothing suggested interruption. The machinery of command continued forward, steady and impersonal, prepared to transform instruction into consequence once again. And somewhere within that movement, obedience waited to become fatal.